You don't know who you are until you've lost everything you thought you were, until the money is gone, until the reputation is shattered, until the titles are stripped, until the friends are silent. You don't understand strength until there's nothing left to lean on except yourself. No guarantees, no backup plan, just silence. And the question, what now? This is where the real lessons begin. Not when you're winning, not when the world is watching, not when you're applauded, but when you are invisible, empty, broken, still. Lesson 1. Nobody is coming to save you. It sounds cruel, it sounds harsh, but it is the beginning of all true strength. Because when you lose everything, you lose illusions, too. The illusion that someone else will step in. The illusion that someone will make it right. The illusion that you are owed comfort because you tried hard or were a good person. Loss strips all that away. It shows you that rescue is not coming from the outside. No message, no miracle, no rescue line, just you and the weight. And the question, will I stand? Most people don't. They reach for distractions, for blame, for escape, for anything that keeps them from facing the truth, that they have no choice now but to build. And that building begins with the smallest things. Getting up, sitting in silence, drinking water, taking a breath. Because when you've lost everything, everything becomes sacred, and you begin to realize that the only thing left to develop is character. Not the kind that speaks, but the kind that survives. Character that holds still in the collapse, that doesn't seek comfort but chooses clarity, that doesn't ask why me, but instead, what do I do now that it's just me? That question is terrifying, but it is the seed of every new identity you will ever build, because from this moment no one can take credit for who you become next. This is yours. Lesson 2. People don't love you, they love what you give them. Another hard truth, another painful realization that only comes when the giving stops, when the money dries, when the opportunity ends, when your smile can no longer hide the storm. Suddenly the room clears. The phones stop ringing. The attention disappears. The ones who once said, "We're family," become strangers. And that is not something to be angry about. It is something to wake up from. Because when you've lost everything, you see clearly that conditional love is not love at all. It was transaction. It was convenience. It was proximity to benefit. And now that the benefit is gone, so are they. But that is a gift, because what you're left with is real. The few who stayed, the ones who called when there was nothing left to gain, the souls who stood with you. In the absence of glory, and most importantly, you are left with yourself, and you learn that your value was never in what you gave. It was in who you are when you have nothing to give. That's when you realize how much you were giving to be loved, to be seen, to feel like you mattered. And now, you are learning to matter without performance, to be enough without producing, to be human without being useful. That is freedom, not easy, but pure. Lesson 3. Losing everything teaches you that pain is a doorway, not a wall, not an end, not a punishment, a portal to clarity, to rebirth, to true resilience. Because when life takes everything, you stop negotiating. You stop asking for permission. You stop softening your voice to be liked. You start moving from truth, from instinct, from silence, and what you create in that space is no longer contaminated by fear. Because the worst has already happened. You've fallen. You've been betrayed. You've watched your world burn, and yet you are still here, still breathing, still standing. So what is there left to fear? Judgment. You've been judged. Rejection. You've been abandoned. Failure. You've survived it. So now you're free. And that freedom is dangerous. Because it cannot be controlled. You no longer fit in the systems that were built to keep you pleasing. You no longer agree to stories that required you to stay small. You no longer pretend just to stay liked. Because now you understand that losing everything was actually losing what never truly belonged. And what remains is you. Not the version the world molded, but the one the fire revealed. Raw, honest, awake. And that version will never go back to sleep. There's something strange that happens when everything you thought you needed is gone. You begin to see what was real and what was never real. In the first place, you begin to separate what you believed you couldn't live without from what was actually holding you back. You realize that what you thought was the foundation was just decoration, that the people you thought were roots were just leaves. And that revelation doesn't come with joy. It comes with silence. A silence so loud it drowns every illusion you once clung to. That silence becomes the beginning of a new language. The language of truth. The language of the self. The language of rebuilding. Without the need to be seen. You stop showing up for applause. You stop creating for validation. You stop explaining your pain to people who only want to be entertained by your story, because now you're not surviving for an audience, you're surviving for meaning. And that shift changes everything. Your mornings become sacred, not rushed, not filled with scrolling, but grounded in stillness. Your evenings become rituals, not escapes, but returns to your center. You begin to protect time like it's your only currency. Because you've already lost too much of it. Chasing things that crumbled the moment you needed them most, and so you simplify. Not because you're broken, but because you're finally awake. You start saying no. Not to be cruel, but to be clear. You start letting people go. Not because you hate them, but because your peace no longer negotiates with their chaos. You begin walking slower. Not because you're tired, but because rushing was how you missed the signs the first time. Now you listen to your gut, to your body, to the rhythm of what feels aligned. And that alignment doesn't always come with certainty. It comes with trust. Trust that what you are becoming is worth more than what you're leaving behind. Even if that behind once felt like everything. Lesson 1. Hits differently now. No one is coming to save you. But now that doesn't scare you, because you've met the part of you that's capable of saving yourself, and that part isn't loud. It doesn't scream. It doesn't beg. It simply rises, without drama, without announcement, without waiting. You begin to notice that your voice carries a different weight now. Not because you're saying more, but because you're needing less. Your silence becomes a boundary. Your absence becomes a statement. Your stillness becomes the evidence that you're no longer in survival mode, but in sovereign mode. And people will notice the shift. Some will misunderstand it. They'll say you've changed. They'll say you've become distant, cold, different. And they'll be right. Because pain doesn't just break you. It reshapes you. You're not who you were before the fire. You are quieter now. More precise. Less tolerant of nonsense, less impressed by appearances. Because you know what's left when the lights go out. You know who disappears when things collapse. And that knowing is what now guides you. You've stopped asking, how do I get it all back? You've started asking, who do I never want to be again? You've stopped asking, when will it feel like before? You've started asking, what was I blind to back then? Because the loss was not just material, it was identity. And that was the real blessing. You lost the version of you who thought success was measured in applause. You lost the part of you that needed to be everything to everyone. You lost the persona that was built on perfection instead of presence. And now you're building differently. You are no longer trying to return to what was. You are building from what is. And what is may be small, quiet, unnoticed, but it is yours. And that is enough. There's a strange kind of wisdom that only enters when everything you built falls apart. Not the kind of wisdom that's quoted on a screen. Not the kind that sounds beautiful in someone else's words. The kind you bleed for, cry for, burn for. The kind that comes when your pride is peeled off. When your plans are shattered, when your timeline laughs in your face. It begins in stillness. The kind you didn't ask for. The kind that wasn't chosen but forced upon you by loss, by grief, by disappointment so sharp. You stop trying to pretend, and in that stillness you meet yourself. Not the self you introduce to the world. The one that smiles, nods, delivers, but the one beneath it. Raw, wounded, waiting. You meet the version of you that's been screaming through every success that this isn't it. That something is off, misaligned, fabricated, and now that the illusion is gone, you can't unsee it. This is where the second layer of lesson 1 begins. No one is coming, and strangely you're relieved, because now it's quiet enough to hear your own instructions. You no longer need to be rescued. You need to be rebuilt by you, for you. With hands that finally understand what it means to build something that can't be taken. Because the first life was about appearance. This one is about essence. Before you tried to impress. Now you try to align. Before you showed strength through performance. Now you show strength through restraint. You no longer seek to be validated for doing the hard thing. You simply do it. Because it's who you are now, and who you are is no longer negotiable. The world will still try. It will offer distractions, old flames, shiny detours, soft voices that say you don't have to be so intense, so focused, so alone. But you've already seen what those detours cost, and you are done. Paying to be accepted in rooms that require you to shrink. You've learned the cost of betrayal. Not betrayal by others, betrayal of yourself. You've lived through the weight of ignoring your instinct, of staying too long, of giving too much, of softening your standards until nothing was left except regret. And now you listen sooner, you leave faster, you say no without guilt, because your boundaries are no longer about rejection. They are about remembrance. Remembrance of the version of you that begged for peace while pretending they were fine. You don't want to go back there, ever. So now you protect differently. You are not defensive. You are devoted. Devoted to clarity, to truth, to peace that cannot be bought or borrowed. And that peace is expensive. It costs you everything that isn't real. That's the hidden price of losing everything. It strips you of the fake, the convenient, the cheap comfort that kept you busy. But not whole. Now you have space. And in that space you don't rush to refill. You don't replace. You reflect, you ask, what was I building? Why did it fall? And what will I never allow again? You stop asking, how do I rebuild fast? You start asking, how do I rebuild right? And that slows you down. Not because you are broken, but because you are intentional. Every step now is earned. Every decision is felt. You no longer want more. You want meaning. And that meaning doesn't come from applause. It comes from the mirror. Can you look at yourself at the end of the day and say, I did not betray myself today? That is peace. And peace is the most powerful thing you own once you've lost everything else. Because from peace comes clarity. From clarity comes courage. And from courage comes a life that no longer bends to the noise. This is how you begin again. Quietly, deliberately, unapologetically. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to document it. You don't need to justify it. You just need to take the next honest step, and then the next, and then the next, until one day without realizing it, you've built a life that honors the version of you who almost didn't make it. There is a quiet that follows destruction. Not the silence of shock, but the stillness of seeing clearly for the first time. You begin to move without the noise, without the story, without the weight of performing a life you no longer believe in, and this is where the real work begins. Because when you've lost everything, you stop pretending that what you were chasing was ever enough. You start asking deeper questions. Not how do I rebuild my image, but how do I rebuild my identity? Not how do I regain approval, but how do I regain myself? That is the shift. You stop chasing applause and start chasing alignment. You stop needing to be liked and start choosing to be honest. You stop trying to win back the crowd that disappeared the moment you fell. Because now you see it. Who was real? Who stayed? Who called? Who listened without taking? Who stood beside you without needing an explanation? And most importantly, you see yourself for who you truly are. Not a title, not a provider, not a personality, but a person who endured and decided to rise. Not in anger, not in ego, but in responsibility. Lesson 2 becomes embodied now. People don't love you. They love what you do for them. And that truth no longer wounds you. It frees you. You stop confusing usefulness with love. You stop measuring your worth by what you offer. You stop overextending just to be kept, and you begin to define connection by reciprocity, not by access. You stop giving to be chosen. You give because it's who you are, not because you hope they'll stay, and if they don't, you no longer shrink. Because love built on expectation is not love, it's transaction, and you are not for sale. You no longer belong to people who cannot sit with your truth. You no longer entertain dynamics that punish your boundaries. You no longer hide your exhaustion to keep others comfortable. You show up as you are, tired, healing, honest. And if that makes people uncomfortable, you let it, because your comfort is no longer optional. You've spent too many years abandoning yourself to maintain peace. That was never real. Now you create peace by standing fully in who you are becoming, and in that presence you begin to experience a different kind of solitude, not isolation, but sovereignty. You are alone but not lonely, because you are full of clarity, full of lessons, full of power that no one gave you and no one can take. And from that fullness, you start to build again, this time without needing it to look impressive, without rushing, without proving, just one step at a time. Simple, sincere, aligned. And that slowness is unfamiliar, because before you moved from fear of being behind, fear of being forgotten, fear of missing out. But now you move from presence, because you know that anything built from fear will require fear to sustain it. And you are done fueling your life with survival. You are building from soul now, and that soul does not chase. It attracts, not with performance, but with peace. People begin to notice. They say, "You've changed." And you have. Not because you became someone new, but because you finally became someone real. You no longer apologize for your silence, you protect it. You no longer explain your standards, you embody them. You no longer need to be invited. You are already where you're meant to be. And from this place you begin to understand the real gift of losing everything. It forced you to remember what never leaves. Your breath, your values, your truth. Your ability to begin again without bitterness. To begin again without pretending. To begin again without seeking. And that is the birth of the strongest version of you you've ever known. There's a moment where you no longer fear starting over, because you've done it before, and what you found wasn't devastation, it was definition. You didn't lose yourself, you met yourself, and this time, you're not building from desperation, you're building from direction. This time you're not proving, you're preserving peace, preserving presence, preserving your principles from all the pressure that used to break you. Because now, you've become someone that pressure can't move, not because you're numb, but because you're centered. And that centeredness is not confidence, it's clarity. You don't need to feel bold, you just need to feel clear. And from that clarity comes consistency. You wake up and do the hard thing without debate. You hold your boundaries without broadcasting them. You protect your peace not by running but by remaining calm, remaining honest, remaining grounded when chaos rises again. Because it will. Life doesn't stop testing you just because you passed once. Lesson 3 becomes reality now. Pain is a doorway, not a destination, and the doorway opens again. Each time you're tempted to regress, to go back to who you were before you were stripped, to answer the call of old coping mechanisms that whisper comfort, but cost your alignment. And you have to decide every day, not to go back, not to escape, not to shrink, not to soften your truth to be accepted. You have to decide that your rebirth was not a phase but a foundation, that the new you is not conditional, not based on praise, not based on ease, not based on support, because sometimes support won't come, and you must still stand. Sometimes love won't be returned, and you must still give. Sometimes the world won't notice, and you must still rise. Because your movement is no longer tied to being seen, it's tied to being you, fully, fiercely, finally. And from that space, you become unshakable, not because you don't feel, but because you feel everything and still choose to remain. You don't run from discomfort, you let it shape you. You don't fear endings, you see them as invitations. You don't panic in loss. You remember that what's real can never be taken. And this changes how you walk. You no longer beg. You invite. You no longer chase. You attract. You no longer compete. You align. You no longer sacrifice yourself for a seat at the table, because you've learned to build your own. A table with truth, with slowness, with standards. A table where your voice is not raised but heard. A table where peace is not a bonus but a baseline. And around that table you place only the few who earned the right to sit there. Not because they're perfect, but because they're present. Not because they agree, but because they respect. Not because they flatter, but because they see you without agenda. Because after losing everything, you no longer welcome people who treat access like entitlement. You no longer keep those who disappear. When the light fades, you no longer explain why you've changed. Because real ones don't need the explanation. They feel the change, and they honor it. And those who don't aren't your burden. They are your reminder that you've outgrown the spaces that needed you to abandon yourself to feel loved. You're no longer there, you're here, rooted, clear, quiet, whole. There's something sacred about starting over. Not because you wanted to, but because you had to. Because everything you depended on collapsed. Everything you used to identify yourself disappeared. And all that was left was the question, what now? In that question, you stopped reaching out. You stopped asking the world, who am I? What do I deserve? Am I still valuable? Because the silence no longer scared you. It became your sanctuary. The pause became your protection. The loss became your liberation. And that liberation is the lesson people miss because it comes wrapped in devastation. When you lose everything, you realize what matters was never external. Not the job, not the title, not the house, not the bank account, not even the recognition. Those were layers. What mattered was the person underneath. The one who can wake up with nothing and still say, I'm not done. The one who can breathe through heartbreak and still whisper, I'm still here. The one who doesn't collapse at rejection because they are no longer held together by acceptance. This is real strength, not shown in the gym, not proven by trophies, not broadcasted in highlight reels, but felt in the quiet moment, after everything falls apart and you choose not to, because you've learned that resilience is not about bouncing back. It's about building again, without resentment, about showing up to the ashes of your old life and saying, I'll plant something new here, even if no one believes, even if no one claps, even if no one comes, because the old you needed applause. The new you needs truth, and truth is quiet. It doesn't beg, it doesn't sell, it doesn't shift for likes. It just is, and you just are. No explanation, no need to impress, no more games. You are done. Done performing, done convincing, done trying to be enough for people who never even saw you. Because now you see you. Clearly, brutally, beautifully. And in that seeing, you remember who you were before the world told you who to be. And that remembering is painful, because it shows you how many years you lived as someone else. How often you said yes when you meant no. How often you smiled when your soul was screaming. How often you gave not out of abundance, but out of fear that love would leave. But it left anyway, and you survived. So now you no longer live to be kept, you live to be clear. You no longer show up to be picked. You show up to be whole. And wholeness isn't about having it all, it's about needing less. Because you finally became enough. You stopped negotiating with people who never honored your full value. You stopped over-explaining to people who only listened to refute you. You stopped making space for people who couldn't hold your growth, and from that stopping came starting. You started walking slower, breathing deeper, saying less. You started asking, is this kind to my nervous system? Is this aligned with my values? Is this something I'll respect myself for tomorrow? And that changed your life. Not all at once, but day by day. You began living like someone who had already lost it all, and realized that the only thing that matters is how you live now. This is the power you never had before. Because before you were afraid to lose. Now you understand that loss was the beginning, not the end. When you've lost everything, you don't come back the same. You don't return to the version of yourself who tolerated being misunderstood, just to feel accepted. You don't slide back into dynamics that required you to be less, in order to be loved. You don't re-enter spaces that drained you just because they once clapped for you. You move differently, not faster, not louder, but truer. You stop asking, what do they want from me? And you start asking, what does this cost my peace? Because now, you know the price of betraying yourself. and you're not willing to pay it again. Before you said yes, just to keep the peace. Now you say no to preserve it. Before you bit your tongue to stay liked, now you speak less. But when you do, it lands. Because your words aren't shaped by approval anymore. They are shaped by principle. And that principle isn't flexible, not because you're harsh, but because you've rebuilt your life on a code that you cannot violate without bleeding internally. That's what happens when you lose it all. You begin again, with non-negotiables. Not a wish list. A standard. You no longer hand your energy to people who've proven they can't hold it. You no longer share access with those who confused your presence for obligation. You no longer explain your clarity to people still committed to their chaos. Instead, you become quiet, not silent but precise. You spend more time alone, not because you're antisocial, but because you've learned that solitude is the safest place to stay whole. You walk, not with confidence but with calm, because confidence still seeks something, but calm just is. You are no longer chasing a name. You are no longer trying to prove your worth to a world that's addicted to distraction. You are no longer trying to fit in, because you've seen how much that costs. Now you'd rather be real and misunderstood than popular and hollow. You've stopped explaining your silence. You've stopped apologizing for your absence. You've stopped making excuses for why you're not as available as you once were. Because the version of you that was always available was also always overwhelmed. And now you protect your capacity. Like it's sacred. Because it is. You don't pick up every call. You don't answer every message. You don't say yes just to keep the image. You say yes only when it's rooted in truth. Because now you measure everything by one question. Does this feel clean, or does this feel costly? And if it costs your peace, your clarity, your self-respect, it's too expensive. You stop negotiating with the parts of you that once begged for crumbs. You stop tolerating the version of you that thought survival was the goal. Now you're not surviving, you're becoming. You're becoming someone who doesn't flinch when people walk away. Because you know that their exit is not your abandonment, it's your alignment. You're becoming someone who doesn't crumble at loss, because you've learned that loss isn't always destruction. Sometimes it's direction, and this changes everything. You don't pray for less pain. You ask for more precision. You don't seek applause. You seek alignment. You don't hope to be rescued. You remember you already survived, and that remembering becomes your rhythm. You wake up and choose yourself again, not because you're selfish, but because no one else can carry the responsibility of becoming you. There comes a time when your energy becomes so precious you stop offering it to the wrong places, not out of bitterness, but out of understanding. Because losing everything teaches you that energy isn't infinite, that attention isn't cheap, that presence isn't to be shared with those who treat it like air. And this becomes your compass. Not who likes you, not who claps, not who remembers your birthday, but who honors your space without needing to consume it, who listens without waiting to speak, who stays even when you have nothing to offer. You stop being impressed by charm, by charisma, by surface kindness, because you've learned that most of what glitters is distraction, that some of the warmest words come from the coldest intentions, that some of the loudest support is empty when you're no longer useful. And so, you protect yourself differently. Not with walls, but with discernment. You watch longer before you open. You speak less, so your truth isn't diluted. You walk slower so your peace stays intact. and those who can't move at your new pace fall away naturally. No fight, no fallout, just silence. Because healing doesn't come with a loud goodbye. It comes when you stop justifying why you're still bleeding for people who refuse to stop cutting, and you have stopped. Not because you're done loving, but because you finally learned that love without boundaries is self-destruction. So now you love differently, more slowly, more intentionally, more quietly. You choose presence over performance, substance over stimulation, honesty over harmony. Because before you kept the peace at the cost of your integrity, now you keep your integrity, even if peace must be redefined. You learn that not every connection deserves maintenance, that not every memory deserves a resurrection, that not every version of you deserves preservation. Some must be let go so you can become someone new, and becoming requires burning, not for revenge, but for renewal. You burn the stories that taught you to settle. You burn the patterns that kept you pleasing. You burn the bridges to identities you built only to survive. And from that flame, you rise. Not loud, but light. Light, because you no longer carry what was never yours, their expectations, their guilt, their confusion, their unreadiness. You don't wear it anymore. You return it with grace. And what's left is space. Space to breathe, to feel, to choose again. And this time you choose deliberately where you go, what you say, who you allow, what you repeat. Because you understand now that repetition is identity. And your identity is no longer reactive, it is refined. And in that refinement you find rest. Not rest because you finished everything, but rest because you no longer chase what doesn't match your soul. And those around you feel the shift. Some admire it, some avoid it. Some try to provoke the old you just to see if you'll return, but you don't. Because that version of you was buried when you lost everything. And in that loss you found something greater. A standard. A silence. A strength. So deep it no longer announces itself. It just is. You begin to understand that the most powerful people are not the loudest. Not the ones who control rooms. Not the ones with influence or charm. The most powerful people are the ones who no longer need anything to feel whole. They don't need applause. They don't need explanation. They don't need others to mirror back their worth. Because they've seen what remains when everything external is removed. And in that bareness they found something that can't be named. A stillness. A standard. A sovereignty. And once you've touched it, you stop settling. Not just for people, but for patterns. For old coping. For half-hearted yeses. You stop tolerating the subtle ways you betray yourself just to be included. And you start choosing a deeper kind of inclusion. The inclusion that only happens when you belong to yourself. You begin to feel the cost of every self-betrayal you once normalized, every conversation you stayed in too long, every plan you agreed to too fast, every truth you swallowed because they weren't ready. You carry it all. Not as guilt, but as data, and you use that data to build a new design, a new daily life, one rooted in discernment. You no longer rush to reply. You wait for your gut to say yes. You no longer feel guilty for needing space. You claim it, like a right, not a privilege. And in doing so, you find out who was really there, because they loved you, and who was there, because you were useful. This is the quiet grief that comes after loss, not the grief of what fell apart, but the grief of realizing how much of your life was built to keep others happy, while your soul was starving, and you feel it, all of it. The heartbreak of having to walk away from what once made you feel alive. The ache of outgrowing people you still love, but can no longer follow. The sorrow of realizing that some bridges can't be fixed, because to fix them would require you to become small again, and you're not willing to do that. Not after everything you've rebuilt. Not after every night you chose not to numb. Every morning you got up without a reason except I said I would. Not after all the quiet work you did that no one saw. You've earned this version of you, and you will not trade it for validation. Not again. So now you walk slower. Not because you're unsure, but because you're intentional. You rest more. Not because you're weak, but because you're wise enough to know that doing more isn't always doing better. You love quieter. Not because you're cold, but because loud love was often desperate love. Now your love is rooted, and it doesn't chase. It invites, it holds, it chooses, but it never begs. Because you don't beg when you know your worth. And knowing your worth after losing everything is a different kind of knowing. It's not theoretical. It's not self-help. It's not a quote on a wall. It's in your bones. It's in your pauses. It's in your posture. It's in the way you no longer explain why your energy has become so selective. You don't owe anyone a version of yourself that makes them comfortable at the cost of your peace. That season is over. Now, you are in a new one. A season of choosing, not reacting. A season of building, not performing. A season of living, not proving. And that is the season you never thought you'd reach. Back when you were lost and broken and on the floor, wondering, will I ever be okay again? You are not just okay, you are becoming unshakable. At some point you realize that strength is not how much you can carry. It's how little you're willing to carry when it no longer serves your soul. It's how quickly you release what makes you question your value. It's how bravely you walk away from what once made you feel important, but now makes you feel invisible. You don't need to be everything to everyone anymore. You don't need to respond just because they reached out. You don't need to explain why you no longer shrink to fit what they remember, because remembering is not the same as honoring, and you're no longer interested in being remembered by people who were never present when you were breaking. You're interested in being real. Now every interaction is filtered through one question. Does this make me abandon myself? If the answer is yes, you don't go. Not to the dinner. Not to the call, not back to the relationship that felt like home, but treated you like a stranger. You've learned that not all comfort is healthy. Some comfort is just familiarity with pain, and you are not going back. Just because you're lonely, you are not repeating. Just because it's quiet, you are not rushing. Just because you're scared of standing still. Because stillness is not the enemy. It is the place you finally met yourself. In stillness, you heard the truths you avoided for years. In stillness, you faced the grief of becoming. And in stillness, you found the clarity to begin again. Not from desperation, but from devotion. Devotion to a new life. One built slowly, one built silently. One built in service to your highest self, not your loudest wound. You're no longer reacting to loss. You're responding with leadership. You don't carry people who won't walk. You don't prove your worth to people who benefit from your self-doubt. You don't tolerate spaces that demand your light but can't handle your truth. This is the quiet shift that happens after you lose it all. You stop negotiating with your nervous system just to feel accepted. You stop second-guessing what your body is clearly telling you. You stop needing to be validated for every no you give. And in that stopping, you become stable. Not because life gets easier, but because you do. You get better at listening, at holding, at knowing when to rest and when to rise. You stop confusing urgency with importance. You stop confusing attention with affection. You stop confusing attachment with alignment. And that frees you, because now you're building from stillness. You're choosing from clarity. You're speaking from principle. You're no longer using noise to avoid yourself. You're no longer chasing healing like it's something outside of you. You're walking with it, daily, deliberately, with fewer words and deeper intention. And as you walk, you stop checking who's watching, because you've learned that true growth is rarely witnessed. It happens in kitchens at 5 a.m., in notebooks no one will ever read, in decisions no one claps for. It happens in the way you no longer react, in the way you stay soft without folding, in the way you choose to stay when escape is an option. But truth demands presence. You've changed, and not everyone will understand that. They'll miss the old you, the one who overgave, who over-explained, who overcommitted. Let them mourn what no longer serves you. Let them misread your quiet as distance, your boundaries, as coldness, your standards, as ego. You don't need to be understood by people, still committed to misunderstanding themselves. You just need to be consistent with the version of you that survived the fire. When you lose everything, you lose more than possessions. You lose illusions. You lose identities. You lose masks you didn't even know you were wearing. And in that shedding, you meet something far more honest than success. You meet self-respect. The kind of self-respect that doesn't need to be loud to be present. The kind that shows up in how you protect your mornings, in how you leave rooms that once defined you, in how you say no, without needing a justification beyond "it doesn't feel right." Because now you don't outsource your knowing. You don't defer to consensus. You don't explain your boundaries to people who've shown they benefit from your confusion. You see clearly now, not because life became easier, but because you stopped lying to others, to yourself, to the version of you that said, if I can just hold on longer, maybe they'll change. But they didn't, and you did. You changed. You learned that love doesn't always return, that loyalty is not always mutual, that peace is not always shared, and you stopped waiting. You stopped bleeding so others could stay comfortable. You stopped overperforming for people who never noticed the effort. You stopped trying to earn what was never yours to keep. And from that stopping came a new standard, one that doesn't flinch when people walk away, one that doesn't soften to be swallowed easier, one that doesn't collapse. Just to prove you're still the good one. You are not available for anything that requires you to abandon yourself. That is your new line. Not because you're angry, but because you're aware of how far you've come, of what it cost to get here, of how many pieces you had to gather alone. There were days you didn't speak, not because you had nothing to say, but because no one knew how to hold it. There were nights you didn't sleep, not because of noise, but because of the quiet that came when your coping mechanism stopped working. You sat in that dark and found your own light. Now you carry that light with reverence. Not everyone gets access. Not everyone gets answers. Not everyone gets explanation. Because you've stopped living for comprehension, you live for congruence. That alignment is the loudest statement you'll ever make. It is in the way you pause before saying yes. It is in the way you leave without slamming doors. It is in the way you no longer make promises to people who forget themselves. Every time things get hard, you're no longer afraid of being misunderstood, because you know that understanding requires willingness. And most people aren't willing to see beyond their version of you. That's not your fault. That's not your problem. Your responsibility is to stay loyal to your evolution, to protect the clarity you bled for, to live not in avoidance of pain, but in response to truth. And truth is where you now rest. You don't seek closure from those who disappeared. You don't re-explain your boundaries just to sound kind. You don't keep people close just because of history. You choose presence over pattern and peace over familiarity, even if it means being the one who outgrew everything. Because you have. You've outgrown scarcity. You've outgrown pretending. You've outgrown relationships that felt like negotiation. And now you give from overflow, not obligation. You connect from wholeness, not hope. You speak from clarity, not from fear of being left, because losing everything showed you that the only thing you can't afford to lose is yourself. You no longer fear losing. You fear betraying yourself just to keep what was never real. That's what losing everything taught you. That most of what you clung to was built on fear. Fear of being alone. Fear of being unloved. Fear of being forgotten. But now you've stood in those fears, you've walked through them, and what you found on the other side wasn't emptiness. It was clarity. The kind of clarity that shows up when you stop surviving and start choosing. You've learned that peace is a practice, not a place. That love is a choice, not a transaction. That healing is a rhythm, not a result. And that strength isn't something you show, it's something you hold when no one is watching. You no longer need to convince anyone that you're doing better. You are. And even if no one sees it, even if no one claps, even if no one ever understands the weight of what you carry quietly, you know. You know because of how you respond now. You know because of how you protect your energy now. You know because of what you no longer entertain. You know because you are still here, not pretending, not performing, not proving, just present. And in that presence is power. The power to walk away from what no longer fits, even if it still calls your name. The power to say no without guilt, because you finally know what your yes is worth. The power to sit alone, not because you're unwanted, but because your own company is finally safe. You no longer seek to be understood by everyone. You seek to understand yourself more deeply. Every trigger, every fear, every pattern, you trace it back. Not to judge, but to liberate, because you're done living in loops. You're done being the version of you that makes others comfortable but leaves you empty. You've buried that version with reverence. Because even though they helped you survive, they're not who you need to be to thrive. Now you walk with wisdom. Not because you read more, but because you lived what no one saw. You've learned that you don't become powerful by gaining. You become powerful by releasing. Releasing old narratives, old obligations, old ways of seeking love through sacrifice. And that release has made space. Space for truth, for connection, for a life that feels clean even if it looks quiet. You no longer chase the life you lost, because now you see it clearly. It didn't end. It expired. It served its role in showing you what you no longer want to repeat. And now you choose different. You choose slow over scattered, whole over hurried, aligned over admired. Because admiration without alignment is just noise, and you've had enough of that. Now you live, not to be liked but to be real. You speak not to be heard, But to be clear, you move, not to be seen, but to be sovereign. And in this movement, you heal, not all at once, but fully. One day, one choice, one breath at a time. And if no one claps, that's okay. Because you know the sound of your own soul when it's finally at peace. That's the applause you never want to lose again.